Hi guys, this is Micah Cousins recording for English 1510. I'm going to be reviewing the upcoming assignment, the multimodal presentation that's going to be due after Thanksgiving break. If you have questions about anything I discuss in this brief overview, please email me and let me know. Again, this is just going to be a brief overview of the multimodal assignment, so if you have questions, please let me know. I'm sure there will be something that I forget to go over, and that's par for the course, but again, just let me know via email. Okay, so I wanted to start by talking about why we're doing this assignment, and then I'll talk about the particularities of the assignment. And I think students deserve to know the rationale behind assignments. But the short version is the college, because of different state and federal committees, they decide that state universities need to have an introductory writing course. That would be English 1510. And in that writing course, the students need to present some sort of presentation with multimodal elements. And multimodal, again, means it has elements other than just language. So in this case, that's going to mean visuals in addition to language. So again, the college, because of different state and federal committees, requires students in an introductory writing course to deliver a presentation involving not just language, but visual elements as well. That is the basic explanation for why I'm requiring you to do a multimodal presentation, which again is just a presentation with some visual elements. That's all that means. The longer version is because I want to talk about ethical rhetoric versus unethical rhetoric, because I think that's a very timely topic in our society, and I think it would be remiss of me as a writing teacher not to at least cover it just a little bit. This is going to be a very, very short abbreviated unit, but I felt like even a brief foray into this topic was better than nothing. I want to preface this by saying I'm not a philosophy major. I'm just a English major turned PhD in poetry. So I'm approaching this as someone who is not of that specialty. Again, this is just my perspective on it. If you want more in-depth information about any of these topics, go talk to a philosophy major. They will be more than happy to talk to you about this. But I wanted to start, again, by assuring you that I will get to the presentation in just a minute, but I've got to start a couple thousand years back. What is rhetoric? We've mentioned that term in class before. So the assignment, the multimodal presentation, is going to be an exercise of rhetoric. What is rhetoric? Where do we get that term? Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher. He lived many millennia ago. And you're probably familiar with his ideas. We've talked about them in class a little bit before. You can find a link in the presentation that I'm going to post on Blackboard to an abbreviated sort of summation that's really good for, again, people outside of this discipline, such as myself. Stanford gave sort of this abbreviated version on its website that I found very, very helpful, again, for people who, like me, do not read ancient Greek and are approaching this from outside of the discipline. But it gives sort of an overview of how Aristotle came to be associated with the term rhetoric. Again, rhetoric, he defines it as the ability to see what is possibly persuasive in every given argument. So again, rhetoric for him means the ability to persuade a listener or a reader. And he talks about 3 different modes of persuasion, which we've talked about earlier in the class. They are ethos, pathos, and logos. Those are, again, the 3 elements of persuasion that he identifies. So again, rhetoric, according to Aristotle, is the ability to persuade someone. And again, those 3 elements that he defines are ethos, pathos, logos, credibility, logic, and emotion. Aristotle gets very associated with rhetoric because he coined the term. He coined some of the very foundational ideas about how we think about rhetoric. His text is his foundational text, which is called Rhetoric, is split up into 3 books. The first 2 are, most scholars definitely agree, were written by him. The third may or may not have been written by him. Anyway, again, he's writing and believed to have existed thousands of years ago, so there's a lot of scholarly debate from what I've surmised via the internet about authorship and different translations, but basically there's this debate, according to Aristotle, about the ethics, meaning whether it's right or wrong, to teach people how to use rhetoric. Aristotle takes a very practical viewpoint compared to his opposition, and again, the opposition would be people who say that teaching people how to persuade others could be dangerous, because sometimes people can persuade people to do things that aren't right. Or sometimes people can use persuasion in such a way that is unethical. And what exactly does that mean? That's the heart of the problem. So, on Stanford's website, which I really like that they've done, they've divided it up into these different areas, these different sections. And you'll notice that there's a section about the misuse of rhetoric, which again is about the ethics, and again, ethics meaning is something right or wrong, the ethics of using rhetoric or persuasion. Because, of course, rhetoric in general, and even Aristotle's dialectic-based rhetoric, can be misused depending on what people use it for, which Aristotle acknowledges. For example, an advertisement might convince people to buy a product that isn't a good product, or a politician might use rhetoric to confuse their constituents into voting for something against their own best interests. Persuasion, again, can be used to persuade people to do things that are not in their best interest. But Aristotle says that overall, persuasion and rhetoric are good because he says it's easier to convince someone of the just and good than their opposites. Meaning it's easier to defend what's right than to defend what's wrong. So rhetoric, even when it's misused, will always be outdone or outperformed by rhetoric used to justify what's good. This is a very marked difference from his predecessor. Aristotle was the disciple of a philosopher named Plato, and Plato was a disciple of a philosopher named Socrates. You've probably heard of that name. These are very famous portraits of Socrates. The one on the left was painted by Raphael. And Socrates had a very, very different interpretation of rhetoric. Again, Aristotle's interpretation of rhetoric and persuasion is very practical. He believes that it's a tool that can be used or misused. It doesn't make rhetoric good or bad. He believes in the right hands it can be used to do good things, but in the hands of the wrong person, of course, it could be misused. So again, he doesn't really think about rhetoric in the same way that Socrates did. Well, how did Socrates think about rhetoric? Socrates is very famous. First of all, I should preface this by saying, why do we care about any of this? Why do we care about these philosophers? Well, partially because the definition of rhetoric and Western civilization's way of thinking about rhetoric has largely descended from Enlightenment era thinkers in like the 17th, 18th centuries, and those thinkers were largely inspired by these Greek philosophers and the rediscovery of their works. So it's almost impossible to talk about our modern society's conception of rhetoric and ethical versus unethical rhetoric without talking about Greek philosophy because of the history and the context of those topics. Eastern philosophy approaches the matter very differently because it has a different foundation, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Very briefly, that's obviously not my area of specialization, but it deserves a little bit of a mention, and I'll get to that in just a second. I know that this is very Western-based, and I apologize for that, but I am limited by my area of specialization. So again, why do we care about this? Because it's very hard to talk about rhetoric and ethics and unethical rhetoric without talking about where we derive those terms, where we derive those ideas, and that's a long and complicated history, but basically it leads back to this guy, Socrates. And again, Socrates was the mentor of Plato, who was the mentor of Aristotle. Aristotle was the mentor of Alexander the Great. He penned the foundational text Rhetoric. Now, Socrates didn't pen or write down anything to our knowledge. His words were all written down by his disciple, Plato. But according to Plato, Socrates had a very contentious relationships with the sophists. The sophists, you might have heard of the term sophistry. Sophistry is like the use of words to confuse people. So Socrates called his enemies the sophists, because, and as a derogatory term, meaning that they used language in a way that he thought was deceptive. So there's a very famous exchange, as written down by Socrates' disciple Plato, in which Socrates is asking his opponent, Gorgias, I don't think it's Gorgias, I think it's Gorgias, I apologize. I don't know how to pronounce these ancient Greek names. And he's talking about the power of persuasion. And they're having this exchange, and he's saying, after Gorgias has just boasted about his powers of rhetoric, meaning how able he is to persuade people to do things, that he's even more persuasive than doctors and physicians, Socrates says, you say that you're more persuasive than a doctor or physician. Because again, Gorgias has boasting, bragging about having convinced someone to undergo a medical procedure when their own physician couldn't persuade them to undergo that medical procedure. And he's boasting about the fact that his powers of rhetoric were so advanced that he was able to persuade them to undergo the procedure. And Socrates says, that's really interesting because you're not a doctor or a physician. Gorgias says, no. And then Socrates says, so you're able to persuade someone to do something just by words, not by having any more knowledge than, he certainly wasn't more knowledgeable about medicine than the doctor, and yet he was able to be more persuasive than the doctor. So he excelled the doctor not in knowledge, but in persuasion. And Gorgias is like, yeah. So here Socrates, again, obviously this is a translation. You were saying, in fact, that the rhetorician, meaning the person who uses rhetoric, the person who's trying to persuade someone, will have greater powers of persuasion than the physician, even in the matter of health? Yes, with the multitude, that is. And then Socrates says, you mean to say with the ignorant, for with those who know he cannot be supposed to have greater powers of persuasion. Very true. And then he goes on. And the same holds of the relation of rhetoric to all the other arts. The rhetorician need not know the truth about things, meaning he doesn't need to know anything about medicine in order to persuade someone to undergo a medical procedure. He has only to discover some way of persuading the ignorant that he has more knowledge than those who know. Yes, Socrates, and is not this a great comfort, not to have learned the other arts with the art of rhetoric only, and yet to be in no way inferior to the professors of them? And Socrates answers, Socrates is saying, that's not right. It's not right that people are willing to listen to you rather than a doctor. Because you obviously, and you don't claim to know anything about medicine. So this thing that you're boasting and bragging about, that you're able to persuade people better than their own doctor, is really wrong. Because you don't have any more information or knowledge than the doctor does. You're just manipulating people. Again, he doesn't use the word manipulation, but it's that distinction between what's the difference between manipulating someone versus persuading someone. And look what Socrates says. And again, this is one of the most famous exchanges in Western history. Socrates says, whether the rhetorician, again, that just means the person using rhetoric, the person trying to persuade someone, is or not inferior on this account is a question which we will hereafter examine if the inquiry is likely to be of any service to us. But I would rather begin by asking whether he is or is not as ignorant of the just and unjust, base and honorable, good and evil, as he is of medicine and the other arts. I mean, as to say, does he really know nothing of what is good and evil, base or honorable, just or unjust in them? Or has he only a way with the ignorant of persuading them that he, not knowing, is to be esteemed to know more about these things than someone else who knows? Meaning, it sounds like you're not really interested in whether this medical procedure was going to be good for this person or not. It sounds like you just kind of wanted to show off the fact that you could persuade them to undergo it. Socrates is drawing a pretty hard line here and saying that just because you can't persuade someone to do something doesn't mean you should. And just because you are more convincing doesn't mean you're right. And you'll notice they keep using the word the multitude. That means people who are unlearned or ignorant of these rhetorical arts. People who are victims of Gorgias's manipulation. And then they go on and continue the exchange. And then Socrates keeps bringing it back to justice versus injustice. And he accuses Gorgias of inconsistency. And he continues pressing this point, but Gorgias isn't interested in the truth. He isn't interested in communicating truth to people, or really questions of right or wrong. He's interested in what he can make people do, whether that's in their best interest or not. And Socrates is saying that that's unethical, that is wrong. Because he sees the goal or the obligation of a rhetorician as someone, they have a moral obligation, according to Socrates, to strive to tell the truth. Gorgias doesn't see it in quite that light. Socrates is very, very suspicious of rhetoric. Now down here, you'll notice he has this whole section where he condemns rhetoric that he terms flattery. It is my opinion, Gorgias, the whole of which rhetoric is a part, is not an art at all, but the habit of a bold and ready wit which knows how to manage mankind. Manage meaning manipulate. This habit I sum up under the word flattery, and it appears to me to have many other parts. And he compares it to sort of superficial things. Meaning, rhetoric, as Gorgias is using it, isn't getting to the heart of something. It's just making lies more palatable to people who don't know any better. Meaning, again, it is managing mankind. It is manipulating them. He says this is ignoble. For I call what is bad ignoble. So again, he brands the sophistry of the sophists, represented in this exchange by Gorgias, as the manipulation of people, where their words and the appeal and the flattery of their words become more important than the truth of what, or the lack of truth, about what they are saying. This is the foundational argument at the heart of the ethics of rhetoric. So Socrates' condemnation of rhetoric as a tool for manipulating people who don't know any better becomes softened over the generations. His own pupil and mentee, Plato had a different view of it, and Aristotle, the pupil of Plato, also had a different view of it. But it all comes back to this idea, at least in Western civilization, this very, very famous exchange. When is it right to use words? Is rhetoric just a tool that can be used for good or bad, depending on the intentions of the person using it, or the effect that it produces? Or is there something inherently wrong with rhetoric? With trying to make something appealing instead of worrying about how something is presented, rather than whether or not something is or is not innately true. Again, that's the main debate between truth and flattery, as Socrates calls it. And again, that's a very brief overview of this debate in Western civilization. In Eastern civilization, it's a little bit different. Confucius, which is arguably the most famous foundational philosopher in Eastern history, he has a very, very different view of rhetoric. He doesn't have a foundational text. His words were like Socrates' words recorded by his disciples, not himself directly. And he doesn't have a foundational text about rhetoric. His views about rhetoric can only be inferred as sort of tangents or digressions from his main ideas. Unlike Socrates, who was trying to upset the established view about rhetoric, Confucius views rhetoric as a way of maintaining valuable traditions. But both Confucius and Socrates both are very concerned, and you see this idea cropping up in Eastern and Western civilization, with language as a way of coming in harmony with the truth. Now, Confucius has this idea of the Tao that he's appealing to, right? The DAO is how it's spelled, which is this very abstract idea that we won't get into right now. But he's approaching this topic in a more spiritual sense, whereas Socrates and later Aristotle are approaching this from more of a, not a logical point of view, but I guess the philosophical point of view, whereas Confucius is integrating the spiritual and the philosophical both. But you'll find that the foundational ideas are very similar, but they're approached in radically different ways. Again, Confucius doesn't have a foundational text about rhetoric, but from the things that his disciples record that he said, he was very concerned about rhetoric's capacity to bring people in harmony with the Tao. Again, that large abstract idea of like spiritual rightness, and language's capacity to distance people from that. You'll also see the same ideas. These ideas are as old as civilization itself, arguably older. In the Hebrew Bible, there's this idea about people's lips being impure. In Egyptian philosophy, that's many, many millennia old, there's also this idea of the foundation of civilization being truth. And when people deviate from that through false rhetoric or manipulating people with language, that's when civilization is in danger. These ideas are very, 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 very old. And we all have to grapple with them throughout our lives. So again, that's sort of, a very, very, very brief overview of, the relevance of the idea of ethical rhetoric. Again, when does language persuade someone versus manipulate someone? I thought this would be a good intro to talking about a concept called fallacies. Fallacies, they don't show up by that term in Aristotle's work, but the idea has its origins in Aristotle's work. A fallacy, as defined by this article by Douglas Jordan, he talks about a fallacy as an error in reasoning. I would define it as basically an error in reasoning, but think about when you construct syllogisms. You've got the two premises and then the conclusion. When the syllogism breaks down, meaning when the two premises don't lead to a conclusion, that's what we call a fallacy. And there are lots and lots of different types of fallacies. I'm going to look at a few different examples. And I promise this is all going to be relevant to your presentation, your next assignment due. But just be patient with me, and I promise we'll get there, and we'll talk about the relevance of all these ideas to your presentation. But first I wanted to talk about how fallacies connect to this idea of unethical rhetoric. So rhetoric that is unethical is loosely defined, and it's defined differently by all these different philosophers, but generally it's seen as rhetoric that prioritizes the needs of the speaker over the needs of the audience, meaning it's not concerned with telling the truth, it's concerned with producing a certain effect, whether the effect is good or bad. Again, Aristotle views rhetoric as a tool that can be used for good or bad, whereas Socrates is very suspicious of rhetoric in general, and Confucius has a much more spiritual / philosophical view of rhetoric, and he views it very differently than Western philosophy views it. But again, there's this widespread foundational belief that civilization founded on truth will prosper, and civilizations founded on a lack of truth or lies will not prosper. Aristotle brings up these ideas of enthymemes, which are like versions of syllogisms, and he talks about when these syllogisms break down, when they don't function, and the problem that results in, what we would now call a fallacy, and how fallacies can be used in argumentation, even though they're not logical. They can be used to persuade people. And again, Aristotle doesn't label them as moral or immoral, ethical or unethical, but he does name them as a potential problem. So I wanted to talk about fallacies a little bit this is going to be a brief overview, but I think it's going to be important. So again, bear with me, but let's talk about it. So there are different types of fallacies. We're going to mostly be talking about the informal fallacies. And fallacies, again, aren't always unethical. They're not always wrong, and there's a lot of different scholarly debate about, again, what makes rhetoric right or wrong. In your own life, you're going to have to determine that for yourself. Where is that line between manipulating someone versus persuading someone? But in my personal view, fallacies are a big red flag. If someone is relying only on fallacies, or mixing fallacies in with functioning syllogisms, and kind of indiscriminately, that may be a red flag and a sign not to trust that speaker or that rhetorician. Again, that's just my view. I'm not saying that all fallacies, when used, are inherently unethical, but as a general rule, based on the philosophy that I read and my own personal beliefs, I believe that fallacies can generally be said to be a red flag, right? Meaning if someone, like a rhetorician, is relying on fallacies to make their point and persuade the audience, rather than syllogisms that are functioning, that could be a sign not to trust that person, or what that person is saying is not true. So, let's look at a couple examples of fallacies. And again, in this article, I apologize for my 15 million tabs, gives some examples of commonly named fallacies. I've added a few that are also very common on the PowerPoint, but I wanted to talk about some different examples. I've tried to find examples from politics and, commercials, and from different sides of the political aisle, because almost all politicians use fallacies. I wish it could just be labeled as a Democratic or a Republican strategy. Unfortunately, fallacies are very prevalent on both sides of the political aisle, at least in America. So I wanted to talk about both sides, as well as some other examples from media. So we're going to talk about this fallacy. I'm going to start at minute 38. And this is what we call a false dilemma. This is a type of fallacy where a speaker, again a rhetorician, someone who's trying to persuade an audience, presents two choices as if they're the only two choices available, when in fact there could be many other choices. So like, if someone says we have to do A or B, but you know that there could be a C or D, but that person only presents those two options as a way of manipulating the viewer or reader emotionally. And look how he does that here. Now here he's talking about, again, a political situation.
Great health care, strong borders. We'll build up our military. We have no choice. We have a depleted military. We'll be able to do the things we want to do. when you step into that voting booth today, it's now today, there is one core question for you to consider. Do you want America to be ruled by the corrupt political class? Or do you want America to be ruled by you, the people? That's what it is, by the people. It's the way it was supposed to have been for a long time. We've lost.
Now, again, you'll notice he's setting up an opposition. So, again, the way he's presenting it is you can either be ruled by corrupt politicians, which is a very big generalization, which is a false generalization, which is another type of fallacy we'll talk about in just a second, or by you. Now, those obviously are not the only options that you have on a voting ballot. There are multiple different parties, and they're not labeled quite that clearly. There's probably not going to be one party that's pure virtue and another political party that's pure evil. Right? There's a spectrum of good and bad in each. And yet, the nature of political rhetoric, not just on the Republican side, but also on the Democratic side, on every side, is to paint the other side as evil and your own side as completely virtuous. Because that's very persuasive. It's very emotionally appealing. And again, that's what we call a false dilemma. He's making it sound as if you're going to walk into the voting booth and you're going to have two options on that ballot, one that says evil and one that says good. But of course, that's not the reality. And it's a kind of exaggeration. Students always say, so like a fallacy is like an exaggeration. I'm like, yeah, but there are different types of exaggeration. This is a specific kind. It's called a false dilemma, where you're narrowing all these different options that you have down to two. Now, AOC does the same thing, just a little bit more subtly. I'm going to fast forward to minute 13.
To the political and the standard of dignity that we want to maintain for the public in the United States Congress, I do believe it is in the best interests.
I want to ask you quickly, some Republican members like Matt Gaetz have threatened to try to oust Speaker McCarthy if he threw a motion to vacate. Would you vote with him as a Democrat to get to 218 to oust Speaker McCarthy?
I mean, I think that we would have to cross that bridge when we get to it. Speaker McCarthy has been very weak. I think that he has also engaged in just absolutely terrible decision-making for the American people from...
So you'll notice here, she really tears down McCarthy. I mean, she describes him, again, as she's saying, being extremely weak and very harmful to America. And then, yet she defends her support of him. And look how she defends her support of him.
Continuing to try to cement, denying the right to an abortion among women, to the denial of, to policy that denies the reality of climate change, to basic fiscal irresponsibility and recklessness. We are at the brink of a shutdown right now. And so, absolutely, I think there is grounds. However, we are also in the midst of an extremely chaotic Republican Party, and we do not want chaos to reign in Washington either. So again, I think that is a bridge that we'd cross if we get to it. That is something that the Democratic caucus would also have to come together on and decide how we want to navigate as a collective as well.
Again, what she does is more subtle than what Trump does, but it's the same thing. She's creating a false dilemma. Again, she describes McCarthy as being, according to her, very, very bad at his job. He's done all these horrible things for America. But then she says, but it's him or this Republican caucus that's even worse. So again, she's setting up that dilemma, those two options, as if they're the only options, as if it's either McCarthy or complete chaos of government shutdown, in order to support her defense of McCarthy. Again, someone that she's just excoriated as being horrible for America. But both political parties do this. They'll say one side, the side that they're supporting generally, is the lesser of two evils, when in fact there's not just two options, there's usually multiple options. The truth is that they're just refusing to consider all of the options because it's not politically expedient to do so. Let's look at this one. This is what we call a non sequitur. That's a Latin term. It just means does not follow. And you'll see some examples here. This is Norm Macdonald, so like a vintage like SNL clip. But he'll bring up a point and then something completely different as a way of evoking humor. Non sequiturs can be used in a humorous sense, but it's when you bring up another idea that doesn't even have anything to do with the first idea. So let's take a look.
A lot sooner if instead of mice. After numerous requests, the National Institute of Health has finally granted funds to the University of New Mexico in order to test mice for the deadly hantavirus. Although I'm sure the government would have acted a lot sooner if instead of mice, the hantavirus was killing off rich white guys.
Now, what does the rich white guys have to do with this research? Absolutely nothing. They're two totally disconnected ideas, but he's forcing them together, and he knows that they make no sense together, and that's how he derives humor. That's what we call, again, a non sequitur, which is just a Latin term for does not follow. Another throwback, this is an example of a red herring and a slippery slope, which are both informal fallacies. And again, fallacies just means when someone is using a syllogism that does not function in order to rhetorically appeal or persuade someone. I'm identifying fallacies as a signal, generally speaking, of unethical rhetoric. There's a lot of different philosophical debates about that. That's my own personal view about what makes something ethical or not ethical. Now, this is David Duke. He's a white nationalist, and this is an older interview of him. He was, I believe, the Grand Dragon of the KKK at that time, or very high up in the ranks of the KKK, and he had gone to Britain to spread his sort of racist ideology. And you'll notice that the interviewer asks him some very pointed questions, and you'll notice how David Duke manages to come across as almost reasonable, unless you're really listening to what he's saying.
If, Mr. Duke, your mission here is peaceful and legal, why the secrecy? I mean, why have you been avoiding the police, for example?
Well, first of all, I'm not doing anything illegal by being here. It's only after they serve the papers. I believe in nonviolence. I think that we should react and we should work and organize as white people. But I just want an equanimity here. I want some fairness involved here. And if they're going to treat me this way, they should treat the communists the same way. If they don't, well, that's fine. But I do believe in freedom of speech, and I'm afraid this is giving Britain a bad image in some parts of the world because they're suppressing an idea.
Yeah, but you see, some people say you're here to preach race hatred, or at the very least, racial segregation. You must be aware that this is a very touchy subject in parts of Britain at this present time. So, in fact, are you not contributing to the incitement of hatred and possibly even violence? Isn't the Home Secretary right in wanting to throw you out?
No, sir. If you take a look at our country, the country that I come from, of course, my national origin is here, but the country I come from, you'll see that there's tremendous violence. The children are afraid to walk into their classrooms. You can't walk on many American streets. And this is the widespread violence.
Okay, this is what I would term a red herring, meaning when someone changes the subject, again, they're on the same topic, but he's not really answering the interviewer's question. He's responding to a question, I guess, that he wishes the interviewer had asked. Now, the interviewer asks him, are you here to incite violence and encourage people to discriminate based on racism? And instead of Duke saying yes or no to that question, he starts talking about violence in America, which is not at all what the interviewer was asking him about. And again, that's what we term a red herring, when someone doesn't want to answer the question, typically, or when someone deviates very sharply from the given topic in order to talk about something that's loosely related. So it's not a non sequitur. A non sequitur is usually the two ideas don't connect at all. And David Duke is sort of connecting the two ideas. Violence in America could sort of be connected to the possibility of violence in Britain as a result of his racist creed, but not really. Again, it's red herring as like a distraction from the main topic. So again, instead of answering the interviewer's question, which is, you're here to preach a racist doctrine, right? Duke doesn't say yes or no. He says, there's a lot of violence in America, which again is not at all what the interviewer asked. Now, let's look at this next section, because here he uses an informal fallacy called a slippery slope. A slippery slope is when someone says that if X happens, then Y is going to happen, and then Z is going to happen, and then A is going to happen, and then B is going to happen, without any proof that that chain of events is going to occur. They assume that because one thing happens, all these other things are going to happen as a result, which does not have logical foundation. But look what he says.
Country. The country that I come from, of course my national origin is here, but the country I come from, you'll see that there's tremendous violence. The children are afraid to walk into their classrooms. You can't walk on many American streets. And this is the widespread violence that will come to Britain if indeed the non-whites continue to come in this unending stream.
But Mr. Duke,
So again, he doesn't explain why non-whites coming to Britain is going to lead to the violence that he sees in America. He doesn't provide any proof that there's that violence in America. He just expects the interviewer to believe him. And he doesn't, again, explain how the connection between non-whites coming to Britain is going to lead to violence. It's a slippery slope fallacy. He assumes that the interviewer is going to go along with that, even though it doesn't really explain how he gets from point A to point B. But you'll notice, this has nothing to do with fallacies, but his body language too is very interesting. He addresses his terms with which he addresses the reporter are very interesting. He refers to the interviewer as sir. He appears very polite, clean cut. And he speaks in what I would describe as a mild tone, which distracts from the fact that what he's saying makes no sense. This is another example of a slippery slope. This is used in a more contemporary advertisement.
Little Caesar's Delivery. That's the best thing since sliced bread.
We got a problem. There's a new best thing.
New ideas. Go.
Travel size bread.
Sparkle bread.
Brown pets.
Dear Lord.
Run the numbers.
Ran the numbers.
Run them again.
Sliced bread is toast!
This is not happening! Everything is fine!
Little Caesar's Delivery. Best thing since
Sliced bread! I know.
America's best value now.
So the logic here is that because of Little Caesar's, great product, sliced bread is no longer going to be relevant and is going to lead to sort of chaos and the downfall of bread. Which, again, doesn't really make sense. They don't explain why that would happen or, how one would lead to another. They just... Again, it's not really logical. It just shows a seemingly unconnected series of events stemming from one inciting incident, and it progresses very rapidly and illogically. Again, the foundation of the slippery slope fallacy is if you do X, then all this other stuff is going to happen as a result, even though there's no real logical proof that that will result. Here's another fallacy. I apologize for including Donald Trump twice. He had a lot of fallacies. He's a great example as a rhetorician of someone who used a lot of fallacies. So he's got an ad hominem here and a red herring.
Jeff from Ohio asks on Facebook, Trump says the campaign has changed him. When did that happen? So, Mr. Trump, let me add to that. When you walked off that bus at age 59, Were you a different man, or did that behavior continue until just recently? And you have 2 minutes for
as
this.
I told you, that was locker room talk. I'm not proud of it. I am a person who has great respect for people, for my family, for the people of this country, and certainly I'm not proud of it. But that was something that happened. If you look at Bill Clinton, far worse, minor words, and his was action. His was what he's done to women. There's never been anybody in the history of politics in this nation that's been so abusive to women.
Now, this is what I would call an ad hominem fallacy. Meaning, the interviewer asked Donald Trump about his treatment of women, and Donald Trump briefly addresses that, but not really, and then he quickly starts attacking someone else's character. Again, this is what we call ad hominem. So instead of addressing the complaint against him, he starts attacking somebody else. Like, well, they're worse, right? Which again is not really addressing the complaint that's been made against him. This is also an example of a red herring, because he's trying to distract from his own scandal by bringing up Bill Clinton's scandals. And, I mean, it's an effective tool in rhetoric, but is it ethical? That's the question, and you have to determine for yourself whether you think it's ethical or not to do that. Now here we've got another informal fallacy. This is also a throwback to the 2016 election. This is a false generalization. Look what Hillary Clinton calls her opponent's supporters, without any proof.
You know, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that.
Again, it's a huge generalization, meaning she's lumping a lot of people together and saying that they all share these attributes. Not only is that, okay, maybe that's offensive, but more important to my purpose here, it's not really logical. I mean, to say that all of those people share all those horrible characteristics, I mean, maybe, but it's a pretty obvious, and she acknowledges it herself. She says this is generalistic, and then she says it anyway, because she knows it's going to get people in that room to clap. She knows it's going to get people to clap, and that's what she wants. So again, from a rhetorical standpoint, she succeeds. She got the response that she wanted. But at what cost, right? She uses a fallacy, achieves the desired response, but at the cost of her ethics, right? Same thing up here. Donald Trump uses the ad hominem attack on Bill Clinton, the red herring attack to distract from his own scandal, I think very effectively. I think it works. Again, from a rhetorical standpoint, he succeeds. But at what cost? At the cost of ethics, right? Instead of addressing honestly his own scandal and saying, yeah, I don't have a great history with women. A lot of women have accused me of doing some pretty shady stuff. Instead of really delving into that and addressing the interviewer's question, he just goes on a totally different path. This is our final example. There are other examples of fallacies, but this is the last one I'll talk about right now. Is an example of appeal to authority, which is very commonly used in commercials. You'll notice in this commercial they don't really explain why you should buy the product. There's just kind of this rambling. I mean, maybe, I think it's effective. Again, something can be effective but not logical. I think this personally, I find this commercial very effective emotionally, but it's not logical. There's kind of this rambling explanation of why the product is good, but it's not really explained how SZA is connected to the product. It's just understood that her presence in the commercial is in itself an appeal, because she's famous and she represents an authority figure because she is famous. And when you have an authority figure, whether that's a celebrity or someone else that people trust. When you have that figure linked to a product, people are more likely to buy that product. Not because it's logical to do so, but simply because they're making an emotional connection between fame and all the desirable attributes associated with fame and the product.
Solitude and isolation. It's a blank page and a full mind. It's wanting to share myself and wanting to isolate. The solitude, it tests us, whittles us down until we allow it to make us stronger. It's necessary. Because now, I'm ready.
It's all about to my nerves. Got back on my word and thirsty.
I like how she's in just kind of this mauve abyss. Like, I don't even know where she's supposed to be. But again, it's very emotionally effective. It shows her being alone and kind of in her own world. And that's her sort of artistic integrity and individuality is linked to this product. And there is sort of an argument that the product enables her to be on her own and connect with people through music simultaneously. So there is that argument, I guess. It's not super clear, but you could argue that argument is there. But there's also this other layer, what I would argue a fallacious argument or an argument based on a fallacy, which is that you should buy this product because SZA is recommending it and she uses it. Which I'm guessing that she does not actually use this product. I'm sure she uses something much more expensive than what people like me can purchase. But again, that would be an example of an appeal to authority, which is a very, very common fallacy, especially in commercials or advertising. This applies to your assignment because the multimodal presentation, which is due after you get back from Thanksgiving break, requires visuals in some way. It needs to be 3 to 4 minutes in length. It can't be shorter, it can't be longer. And it must involve an argument. Now, the argument you're going to be making is that you're right for the job. So I'm going to assign each student a job and 4 attributes. And they have to connect the attributes to the job. So they have to argue that X characteristic makes them perfect for Y job. And I'll talk about what that looks like in just a second. But they have to make arguments using fallacies. I want you guys to practice using the fallacies in your argument because I want you to get a sense of what they feel like. Again, I think personally that fallacies are a sign of unethical rhetoric. And I want you to have practice using them, not because I think using them is good, but because I think using them will help you remember them and sort of enable you to recognize them in your own life when people are using them with you. So again, we're practicing unethical rhetoric, not because I think you should do that in your real life, but because I'm hoping that practicing it here in the classroom will enable you to recognize it throughout the rest of your life. So again, you have to have a presentation that involves some visual element. You're going to be applying for a job, and you have to connect the 4 attributes or qualities that you're given to the job. And you have to include fallacies in your argument. There's not a specific number of fallacies that I want you to use, just fallacies in general, so more than one. And you're going to present either on November 29th or December 1st. On November 29th, I'm just going to randomly select half of the class to present that day, and then the rest of the students, whoever's left over who didn't present on November 29th, they're going to present on December 1st. Again, this is in part to meet a university requirement. They want you guys to have a presentation of some sort by the time you come out of this class. I would like this to lead to a larger conversation about the nature of rhetoric. Again, what's the difference between persuading versus manipulating people? And I want you to get some familiarity with fallacies so you can start recognizing them in your life, especially when they're being used against you. Whether you think fallacies are always ethical or unethical. That's up to you. Your definition of ethical versus unethical rhetoric is something you're going to have to develop throughout your life. I'm just asking, I think a familiarity with fallacies could be a good first step in coming to your own philosophical conclusions about what constitutes truth and what does not. I wanted to show an example. This is from a student from a few years ago who did what I thought was a really good multimodal presentation. And we can look at this example again when you come back from Thanksgiving break. She did a really good job. This was her presentation. The job I asked her to apply for, the job I assigned her, was pool cleaner. And she had to make an argument about why she was well suited for a pool cleaner. So she came up with this whole persona, which I thought was really cool. Her name was Steve, and she said she was like a middle-aged man. She had this whole accent, and she came in wearing like cargo shorts and a button-up t-shirt. It was not a button-up t-shirt, like a button-up polo shirt. She had the costume. It was pretty convincing. So this is how she started. This is her first clean. And I thought she did a really good job on the slide because I feel like the graphics are really bad. But I really convinced, it was like, that is exactly what Steve, the pool cleaner, would make his PowerPoint look like. It wouldn't be good. I feel like it wouldn't look professional. It would look like this. I thought that was really clever on her part. Some bad Photoshop. And again, these were her qualifications that she was using. She said mustache, comes in spurts, uncontrollable gas, and fear of banana splits. These are why she's perfect for the job of pool cleaner. First, and now notice she uses a non sequitur here. She links her mustache to productivity. She argues that people with mustaches are 100% productive and people without mustaches are 0% productive, which is obviously a non sequitur. Mustaches and productivity, to my knowledge, are not logically linked. But I thought that was a great use of a fallacy. And she had this appeal to authority by including this fake citation for NASA, which I thought was also a great fallacy. Again, another great use of appeal to authority from this fake quote from Confucius. Another non sequitur. Then she starts talking about what is basically a red herring, this long story about her uncontrollable gas makes her a great pool cleaner because her uncontrollable gas creates such a noxious smell that she has to constantly douse herself in Febreze. And so she constantly has this delicious scent of Febreze wafting around her, and that your pool is going to smell as fresh and clean as Febreze because of her uncontrollable gas. Which I thought made absolutely no sense, and I thought it was really great. It was a great red herring. I wouldn't call it a non sequitur exactly, since she did have sort of a connection between the uncontrollable gas and the pool cleaner. But I just thought it was great. It was a great way to manipulate people's emotions, and I liked the sad music she added as well. She talked about how her cleaning potential comes in spurts. She talks about how she feels a strong desire to clean on Zac Efron's birthday, which again is an appeal to authority. They're talking about a celebrity. She's trying to emotionally manipulate the audience. I love how bad this graphic is. I think that's exactly what Steve the pool cleaner's graphic would look like. And then she just talked about how great Zac Efron was, which I thought was a great red herring. And she said there's a pool in the background of the scene starring Zac Efron. So obviously Zac Efron is connected to pools, and because she likes to clean on Zac Efron's birthday, that means she's a great pool cleaner, and that obviously makes absolutely no sense. So it was a great fallacy. She said that she names her pool cleaner a Fear of Banana Splits 3000, and that it's a great tool. She said she uses the jargon synergy And she says that, when she uses it, it cleans the pool very effectively. She flatters the audience. She says, you deserve a clean pool because you're super great. And I thought that flattery was just really the cherry on top of this presentation. Super unethical, great for the assignment. She had a video, and then she had sort of this finale performance at the end of the presentation, which was really great. She just straight up bribed the judges of her presentation with money, and it was super unethical, and I thought that she really showed that she understood the purpose of the assignment, which again is to demonstrate that you're familiar with unethical rhetoric and some of the tactics that people use to argue, to make an argument, even when the argument isn't logical at all. So I thought she did a really, really good job. The rubric for the assignment, you can find right here. So the logistics, I should probably discuss. So on the day of the presentation, I'm going to randomly assign 2 students to grade your presentation. So again, each student will be grading 2 presentations. Each presenter will be graded by 2 people. So you'll notice that on the grading column on Blackboard, I've assigned 50 points for this assignment, but this rubric only adds up to 25. That's because each presenter will be graded by 2 people, so you'll add those 2 totals together. Student grades the presentation as being a 20, and another grades it as a 25. I would add those together to arrive at the total. So again, I'm going to randomly assign the judges, meaning the 2 students who are going to be reading the presentation on the day of the presentation. And then you, in turn, will be grading at least 2 presentations. The reason I choose not to grade them myself is because I'm not your primary audience. There's going to be like 20 other people in the room, and your job is to impress them, not to impress me. You'll notice that one of their criteria is that you have to be entertaining. That's the advantage of unethical rhetoric. You don't have to worry about whether what you're saying is true or not. You can just be as entertaining as possible. And I think that I really want students to focus on engaging the whole class, not just me. Now, obviously, if I think someone really flubs up the rubric, meaning they didn't even watch the presentation, they were just on their phone the whole time, or totally distracted, and they just, give the presenter a 25, they don't explain why at the bottom or anything like that, I won't change the grade of the presentation. I'll just mark that student's participation points down quite a bit for I feel like not being a very good audience member. So again, I'm going to stick with whatever grade the other students give the presenter. So if they give you a 50, even if I don't agree, I'll keep it as a 50. Maybe I wasn't entertained, but if the other students were entertained, that's what matters. But if I see that the person who's supposed to be judging the presentation, if I don't think they had very good rationale for why they judged it a certain way, I'll take their presentation. I'll take not the presentation points down, but I'll take the judges or the student judging the presentation, I'll take their participation points down, which might just mean they don't get their daily quiz points for that day or another day. So again, hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, please let me know. I'm going to be assigning your jobs and your qualifications. Those are going to be up on Blackboard. If you have questions about fallacies or rhetoric or anything else that we talked about, or any of the logistics, please let me know. And yeah, that's it. I look forward to seeing you after Thanksgiving break.